Hello and welcome to IAMC Radio and Podcast. Today on Understanding Our History, we're exploring the complex landscape of injustice, inequality, and the rule of law in Nigeria.
A very complex landscape indeed.
And our guide for this exploration is legal scholar and activist Dela Faradimi's work, Do Not Die in Their War.
Right.
A powerful critique of the Nigerian system.
It's a searing read.
Yeah.
Faradimi doesn't pull any punches. He argues that the violence we see in Nigeria is not random. It's a direct consequence of these deep-rooted systemic issues.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Sure.
What are some of the historical factors that have contributed to this situation?
Well, there are many.
I'm thinking about things like colonialism,
Yes.
resource depletion,
Okay.
that sort of thing.
You're hitting on some key points.
Okay.
Faradimi emphasizes how the depletion of resources, often tied to colonial exploitation, has intensified competition for what's left.
Right.
This has tragically led to the exploitation of existing social and ethnic fault lines, setting the stage for conflict.
And then on top of that, you have the institutions
Yes.
that are supposed to be upholding justice and equality,
But Faradimi argues they often end up perpetuating the very problems they claim to address.
right.
This is where his concept of linguistic violence comes in.
Yeah, I found that to be a really striking idea. Can you explain that a bit more?
Essentially, he's saying that when people are denied the means to express their grievances constructively through dialogue, through legal channels,
Right.
they're more likely to resort to physical violence.
So it's
It's like a pressure cooker with no release valve.
if the system doesn't allow for peaceful dissent,
Yes.
then violence becomes the only option.
That's the chilling implication. And Faradimi connects this to the targeting of specific groups during periods of unrest. He points, for example, to the Sabangari areas in northern Nigeria.
Why those areas in particular?
Well, these areas are often inhabited by people from different ethnic or religious groups than the majority population.
Okay.
They become easy scapegoats, right?
The other, when social tensions rise.
Because they're already marginalized
Correct.
and lack the power to protect themselves.
Exactly.
And this kind of feeds back into this cycle.
It feeds into the cycle of violence that Faradimi describes.
Right.
He also goes into detail about specific instances of violence, like the Niger Delta conflict.
Right. A region rich in oil,
Yes.
but plagued by poverty and environmental degradation.
Sadly, yes.
What's Faradimi's take on that?
He argues that the violence in the Niger Delta is a direct result of systemic inequality and the suppression of legitimate grievances.
Okay.
He contrasts the government's harsh response to activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, who advocated for the rights of the Ogoni people,
Right.
with their more tolerant approach toward militant groups.
Some might argue that the government was simply trying to maintain order in a volatile situation.
Yeah, I can see that.
How does Faradimi address that?
He acknowledges the complexities, but points to specific instances where the government appeared to be more concerned with silencing dissent.
Then addressing the root causes of the conflict. For example, he highlights how the government often turned a blind eye to the activities of certain militant groups, even allegedly providing them with funding and resources.
So almost like they were playing both sides.
That's the disturbing implication. And this ties into Faradimi's analysis of how political thugs evolved into powerful militant forces, often enabled by corrupt government structures. He suggests that the very people tasked with maintaining order were, in some cases, complicit in creating the chaos.
Wow. It's like the system is eating itself.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not just the Niger Delta.
Right.
Faradimi also examines the rise of Boko Haram and the Fulani herdsmen.
Both groups are now ranked among the deadliest terrorist organizations globally.
That's right. And yet, within Nigeria, there's a reluctance, particularly when it comes to the Fulani herdsmen, to label them as terrorists.
Right.
Faradimi questions why this is the case, and his answer is unsettling.
What does he say?
He argues that it goes back to those in power protecting their own interests,
Oh.
even if it means ignoring or downplaying the violence perpetrated by certain groups. He suggests that labeling the Fulani herdsmen as terrorists would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the government's role in the conflict
I see.
and potentially alienating a powerful voting bloc.
So politics and power dynamics are trumping justice and accountability.
That's the disturbing conclusion Faradimi reaches.
Right.
And this leads him to analyze the individuals who have shaped Nigeria's political landscape.
Okay.
Figures like Obasanjo and Tinubu.
All right, so let's talk about them.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from naming names. Ferratomi dives into the legacies of these powerful figures, exploring their successes and failures within the context of this flawed system.
So when he talks about these guys,
Right.
Obasanjo's got this massive ego.
Yes.
And Tinubu is someone with visionary ideas but lacks self-discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Those are pretty strong statements.
They are.
Does he offer any evidence to support these claims?
He does, drawing on their political careers and decisions.
Okay.
With Obasanjo, Ferratomi points to specific instances where his ego seemed to override sound judgment, leading to actions that ultimately harmed the country.
So, like, what? Can you give me an example?
One example Ferratomi cites is Obasanjo's handling of the power sector.
Okay.
He argues that Obasanjo's focus on large-scale projects, driven by a desire to leave a grand legacy, ignored the need for practical, smaller-scale solutions that could have had a more immediate impact on people's lives.
So it's not just about ego, but also about how that ego manifests in policy decisions.
Exactly.
Right.
And with Tinubu, Ferratomi highlights his role in the development of Lagos State, acknowledging his vision and ability to get things done. However, he also critiques Tinubu's lack of transparency and accountability, suggesting that his focus on consolidating power overshadowed a commitment to democratic principles.
So it sounds like what Ferratomi's saying is that both figures, while possessing certain strengths, were ultimately hindered by their flaws.
Yes.
Flaws that were arguably magnified by the very system they operated within.
That's a sharp analysis, and he goes even further, comparing them to robber barons operating with little oversight or accountability.
Okay.
And to really drive this point home, he even brings up Donald Trump.
He does.
He does.
That seems like a bit of a leap, going from Nigerian leaders to a former U.S. president.
It might seem that way at first.
Right.
But Ferratomi uses Trump as a point of contrast.
Okay.
He argues that even someone like Trump, with his disregard for norms and institutions, is ultimately constrained by the checks and balances present in the American system.
So he's suggesting that if Trump were a Nigerian leader, he'd have been able to consolidate power to an even greater degree.
Precisely.
Wow.
Because the Nigerian system, as it currently stands, lacks those same safeguards.
Okay.
It's a sobering thought.
And it underscores the importance of having a robust constitutional framework and institutions that can withstand the ambitions of individual leaders, regardless of their flaws.
Okay, so speaking of the Constitution, Ferratomi doesn't hold back in his critique of the Nigerian Constitution, does he?
Not at all.
Right.
He argues that the Constitution, instead of being a unifying document based on shared values, often prioritizes sectional interests and nepotism.
Okay.
He sees it as a document that in many ways reflects the very divisions and inequalities it's supposed to address.
So he uses a really striking example to illustrate this point, the story of how Asaba became the capital of Delta State.
Right.
Can you remind me of the details?
Ferratomi claims that Asaba was chosen not for its strategic importance or economic viability, but because it was the hometown of the then head of state's wife.
Okay.
It's a stark example of how personal interests and connections can override objective criteria when it comes to decision-making. It's a blatant disregard for fairness and meritocracy, and it seems like this favoritism extends beyond just the location of a state capital.
You're right. Ferratomi also highlights the recurring demand for 6 regional federating units based on economic viability, a demand that has been repeatedly ignored.
Right.
He argues that this is another example of how the Constitution is used to maintain the status quo and protect the interests of those in power, even if it means sacrificing the well-being of the nation as a whole.
It's as if the system is rigged from the start.
Yes, it is.
And this inconsistency also shows up in how constitutional rights are applied.
Absolutely. Ferratomi points to the uneven application of rights like freedom of religion and movement, arguing that citizens are treated differently based on their ethnicity, religion, or political affiliations. This selective enforcement of the law further erodes the rule of law and undermines the very foundation of a just and equitable society.
Which brings us to one of Ferratomi's most provocative statements.
Yes.
The law does not rule in Nigeria. The Nigerian state cannot afford for the law to rule.
Right.
It's a bold claim. What does he mean by that?
He's not saying there are no laws or that the legal system doesn't exist.
Right.
What he's arguing is that true rule of law, where everyone is held accountable equally, regardless of their position or connections, is simply not a reality in Nigeria. He believes that holding people accountable for past and present wrongdoings especially those at the highest levels of power,
Right.
would threaten the very foundation of the Nigerian power structure.
So it's not a lack of laws,
It's a lack of
a
enforcement.
lack of enforcement,
Exactly.
a selective application of justice that protects those in power.
That's a key takeaway from Faradimi's analysis. He argues that the system is designed to protect those who benefit from its corruption, and that true justice would require a complete overhaul of the system itself.
And he backs up this claim with some pretty damning examples,
The
right?
to his basis that Faradimi points to instances where the rule of law appears to have been sidelined,
Yeah.
such as the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission,
Uh-huh.
the EFCC,
Right.
seemingly being used as a tool to target political opponents rather than impartially pursuing justice.
It's almost as if the pursuit of justice in Nigeria is often a charade, a performance, rather than a genuine attempt to hold people accountable.
That's a harsh assessment.
Yeah.
But it aligns with Faradimi's argument that the system is rigged to protect its own, and this lack of accountability,
Right.
this normalization of injustice, has far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
It creates a culture of impunity where corruption flourishes and violence becomes an acceptable means to an end.
It's a bleak picture, but Faradimi doesn't just leave us with despair, does he?
He does not.
He also offers some glimmers of hope,
He is.
some paths forward.
But before we delve into those,
Okay.
let's take a moment to explore one of the most disturbing aspects of his analysis: the normalization of violence and suffering in Nigeria. He recounts a personal experience in Abuja after the Nyanya bombing in 2014,
Okay.
an experience that deeply shook him.
What happened?
He visited Abuja the day after the bombing
Okay.
and was struck by how normal everything seemed.
Wow.
People were going about their daily routines, commuting to work, shopping, socializing,
Right.
as if this horrific event hadn't just happened.
Yeah, it's like that saying, life goes on,
Right.
but in a really unsettling context.
That's exactly it.
Right.
Faradimi was deeply disturbed by the lack of public mourning or remembrance for the victims. It wasn't just that people were going about their daily lives. It was almost as if there was a collective amnesia, a refusal to acknowledge the trauma that had just occurred.
It's almost like a defense mechanism, a way to cope
Right.
with the constant threat of violence
Right.
by simply shutting it out.
That's a possible interpretation, and it speaks to a deeper societal issue that Faradimi highlights: this desensitization to violence, this acceptance of it as a normal part of life. He contrasts this with the UK's response to the Finsbury Park terror attack,
Uh-huh.
where there was a widespread outpouring of grief, solidarity,
Right.
and a determination to confront the hate that fueled the attack.
He sees this as a reflection of a stark difference in societal values
Yeah.
and respect for human life.
Precisely. And it's not just about how societies respond to isolated incidents of violence. It's about how they value and protect human life in general. Faradimi argues that this desensitization to violence is intrinsically linked to the culture of impunity surrounding corruption.
Right. And he uses that thought-provoking phrase,
Yes.
our thief versus your thief.
Yes. It's a cynical observation, but it captures a harsh reality because there's a lack of accountability and tangible benefits from the government.
Yeah.
People have become resigned to corruption. They've come to see it as an inevitable part of the system. And as long as it's their thief, someone from their ethnic group or region who is benefiting, they're willing to tolerate it.
So it's almost like a twisted form of tribalism,
Yes.
where loyalty to one's group trumps any sense of shared national interest
Exactly.
or a commitment to justice.
That's a powerful way to put it, and it reinforces the cycle of impunity and violence that Faradimi describes, because if there's no expectation of justice,
Right.
if those in power can act with impunity, then there's no incentive to change the system.
It's a bleak picture. But Faradimi doesn't just offer criticism.
No, he doesn't.
He also talks about potential solutions, doesn't he? What does he see as the path forward for Nigeria?
He does, and he's very clear that any meaningful change must come from within Nigerian society itself. It can't be imposed from outside. He stresses the need for a new vision,
Okay.
one that's based on shared values, a genuine commitment to the rule of law,
Right.
and a recognition of the inherent dignity of every human life.
It sounds like a monumental task,
It is.
given the deeply ingrained problems he describes. But is there anything individuals can do?
Yes.
Or are we talking about systemic change that's beyond the reach of ordinary citizens?
Faradimi is adamant that individuals have a crucial role to play. He emphasizes the need for active citizenship, for people to move beyond apathy and resignation and demand better from their leaders. He calls on Nigerians to reject the normalization of violence and corruption, to hold their elected officials accountable,
Right.
and to work together to build a more just and equitable society.
It's a powerful call to action, and it resonates far beyond the borders of Nigeria. His work reminds us that we all have a responsibility to fight for justice, to challenge inequality, and to demand a system that values and protects every human life.
And those are values worth fighting for, regardless of where we live or what challenges we face.
Delphirotomies Do Not Die in Their War is a challenging read,
Yeah.
but it's also deeply insightful and ultimately hopeful.
Yeah.
It's a wake-up call, a plea for change, and a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping a better future.
A future where the rule of law prevails, where justice is not selective, and where every life is cherished.
Until next time, thank you for listening to Understanding Our History.